On 23 June 1944, in a Roman villa headquarters on Lake Albano, south of Rome, a newly promoted two-star general called all of his men together for a formation. Major General Frederick's men had just weeks earlier been the first Allied troops to enter and liberate the Eternal City of Rome. His command was the 1st Special Service Force, a unique unit of American and Canadian soldiers that had fought their way through much of the Italian campaign, earning themselves a legendary reputation. In front of this formation, General Frederick quietly announced he was leaving the unit, and there were audible gasps from his men. Frederick went down the line, shaking the hands of every soldier, saying goodbye to each one of them. Many of his men were fighting back tears, for their general had constantly been on the front lines with them, as attested by 2 Distinguished Service Crosses and 8 Purple Hearts. 2 years previously, in April of 1942, a young U.S. Army lieutenant colonel in the War Plans Division of the War Department was given the assignment of evaluating a curious British proposal to target 14 Norwegian hydroelectric facilities that provided nearly half the power for occupied Norway and thus German industry, and also target the railroad tracks, tunnels, and bridges which carried vital Norwegian mined iron, nickel, and zinc ore to the Nazi war machine. Operation Plough was authored by British scientist Geoffrey Pike, who served on the British Combined Operations Staff commanded by Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. This proposal envisioned a large commando-style force trained in winter warfare, mountaineering, and demolitions, transported by snow machines that could operate effectively in the Norwegian winter, hitting vulnerable targets and escaping back into the White Wilderness before the Germans could respond. The 35-year-old lieutenant colonel was Robert Tryon Frederick, and his evaluation of Pike's proposal was not encouraging. The entire concept was shockingly vague. There was no provision on how to get this unit into Norway, whether by amphibious landing, glider insertion, or airborne parachute drop. Amphibious landings were difficult in the rugged Norwegian coast, were vulnerable to German naval and air attack, and would lack surprise. Nor did the Allies have air superiority over Norway, which meant that any airborne operation would be risky even when conducted at night, not to mention suitable drop zones in the mountains were few and dangerous, especially if you're dropping large equipment. The sparsity of drop zones also severely restricted gliders from landing with heavy snow machines, not to mention that a significant part of the force would need to be glider pilots. No intelligence was included in the proposal that listed actual German forces stationed in Norway, nor was there even a recommendation for the exact size and composition of the commando force to be inserted. There were no snow machines in existence as described by the proposal. Worst of all, there was no provision on how to resupply the force, how to care for and extract casualties, or even how the force might be extracted after the mission was complete. After 12 days of study, Frederick provided his written analysis to his superiors. General Dwight Eisenhower was not happy with the report, but neither could he disagree with Colonel Frederick's recommendation to decline the proposal. Except it did not matter. Eisenhower told Frederick the mission was going ahead, no matter the obstacles and shortcomings, as British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Lord Mountbatten, President Franklin Roosevelt, and Chief of Staff General George Marshall had already agreed on the project. It was a done deal. Now this unit needed to be recruited and trained from scratch, and the entire reason the British brought this idea to Washington, D.C. was that the Brits couldn't do it. All British commando forces were already engaged in or assigned to missions. This unit would have to be either American, Canadian, or Norwegian. On 6 June 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Howard Johnson was offered command of Plough Force and met with Geoffrey Pike, and they immediately did not hit it off. Pike rarely shaved or bathed, dressed like the eccentric genius he was, and always thought he was the smartest man in every room he entered and was not shy about that fact. Simply put, Pike was an asshole, and hardly anyone got along with him. But he was Mountbatten's smartass, so he was in. Pike, for his part, was not impressed with Colonel Johnson. That was strike one. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson met with Major General Eisenhower and said that he would only participate if the project was really going to amount to something and be carried out. Eisenhower was not impressed with Johnson's demands. Strike two. Then Johnson repeated these same criteria to Vice Admiral Mountbatten. Strike three, and he was out. The deeper reality was that Operation Plow was deemed necessary to keep Soviet Russia in the war. In early 1942, the Russians were killing more German soldiers and destroying more German equipment than all the rest of the Allies put together. Hitler was 9 months into Operation Barbarossa, and his invasion of the Soviet Union and its satellite countries had conquered vast swaths of land from Mother Russia. But the Russians, in spite of the casualties they were inflicting, were in jeopardy of completely collapsing, and Stalin was desperately demanding a second front in Europe, anywhere in Europe. Great Britain was not at all prepared for an invasion, except perhaps this conceptual operation in occupied Norway. The Allies knew it was risky, but also knew that they had to do something to relieve the pressure on Stalin to keep the Red Army in the war. If the Soviet Union collapsed, it could lead to a Third Reich so powerful that Great Britain and its overseas colonies, even with the help of the yet unrealized American arsenal of democracy, would not be enough to defeat Hitler's Germany. As conceptually vague as Operation Plow was, it would meet Stalin's demand for a new Western Front in Europe, potentially relieving a great deal of pressure off of Soviet Russia, and so it was a risk that the Allies had to take. Then a British officer from the Combined Chiefs of Staff called on Lieutenant Colonel Frederick and gave him the shock of his life. Frederick had been selected to lead Operation Plow. Frederick learned with surprise that Mountbatten himself had lobbied hard for his appointment, fully knowing that it was Frederick who had attempted to write the eloquent epitaph of Operation Plow. What no one remotely realized at the time was that they were about to create the toughest combat unit of the Second World War and turn Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Frederick into a legitimate legend. But all Frederick could see was that he was now in charge of a mission in which every man who participated would be sacrificed. In essence, it was a suicide squad, a forlorn hope. But Frederick was a soldier, and he accepted the assignment. Now, Frederick was a highly competent staff officer, but he had little else in his background to recommend himself for such a critical mission. In fact, though he graduated from West Point in 1928, he was branched artillery, not infantry. He was a graduate of the Coast Artillery School in Fort Monroe, Virginia, and in 1939 graduated from the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. While assigned to Fort Shafter in the Hawaii Territory, he authored a paper in February 1941 that warned of a potential Japanese carrier-based attack on Pearl Harbor, which, as you might imagine, was received with skepticism. By August of 1941, he was assigned to the War Plans Division of the War Department General Staff under Major General Eisenhower. It was only months after Pearl Harbor that Colonel Frederick found himself assigned to create a unit that he had very competently refuted. Only Ruth, his wife of 13 years, got a hint of the doubts within him. The officers and men around him only ever saw a fully invested commander. So with this assignment, he went to work, and his first stop was Canada to meet with members of the Canadian government and Canadian military, hoping to recruit Canadian support. On 13 June 1942, Canadian Army Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Kenneth Stewart approved the participation of Canadian soldiers in the project. This was completely without precedent for the Canadian Army to approve what was almost de facto permission for Canadian soldiers to join the United States Army. Administratively, the Canadians would still be in the Canadian Army and receive Canadian Army pay, but their uniforms and equipment would all be supplied by the U.S. Army. Canadian officers and NCOs would be completely incorporated, commanding both American and Canadian soldiers just as the American Army officers and NCOs. Canadian soldiers would make up half of the unit's officers and 1/3 of its men. The unit would be headquartered in the United States, and the U.S. Army would conduct all planning and intelligence analysis. The Canadian Army wisely retained the right to approve the specifics of any deployment. One of the primary reasons the Canadian government agreed to this completely unique arrangement was they trusted the Americans would only deploy this unit on operations that were worth the risk. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick also wanted to include Norwegian troops, but the Norwegian government in exile reported that the limited number of available Norwegian soldiers were already assigned to other priority missions. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick was given carte blanche to write his own orders for creating this unit, and he gave himself unprecedented powers and authority. These orders, bearing Chief of Staff General Marshall's name, put Lieutenant Colonel Frederick directly under the authority of the Deputy Chief of Staff, giving him total control over the creation of this unit, and the authority to get anything he needed from commanding generals, U.S. Army ground forces, Army Air Forces, services and supply, and the divisions of the War Department General Staff. Colonel Frederick consulted with psychologists on how to find and recruit the type of men he needed. Following their recommendations, Frederick's recruitment flyers and posters asked for men between the ages of 21 and 35 and who had completed 3 or more years of grammar school and had worked in the following occupations: lumberjacks, forest rangers, trappers, hunters, north woodsmen, game wardens, prospectors, miners, and explorers. His only description of what these men were volunteering for was that they would fight and operate in extreme winter conditions and must be parachute qualified. He put out his recruitment requirements to both the U.S. and Canadian Army. Besides recruits, Colonel Frederick knew he needed a table of organization and equipment, the list of how many men in the unit, how it would be organized, and what type of weapons and equipment they would be issued. A training base suitable for winter warfare training that could house 1,500 to 2,000 troops. Expert instructors for parachuting, cross-country skiing, mountain climbing, winter survival, basic and advanced weapons training, hand-to-hand combat, demolitions, and small unit tactics to include patrolling, raids, and ambushes. Aircraft, pilots, and mechanics to support basic airborne qualifications and follow-on combat and resupply airborne drops. A vehicle manufacturing company willing to design and build the tracked machine that could operate in snow and be parachuted or carried by glider into combat, to be delivered within 6 to 8 months. The first requirement Frederick pursued was the machine necessary to move his troops over the snow. Snowmobiles wouldn't be invented until 1960, so the closest thing was a 25-horsepower snow toboggan invented by a Wisconsin outdoorsman named Carl Eliasson, but it was simply too small and underpowered. A completely new vehicle had to be invented. With the expert help of Brigadier General Raymond Moses, Assistant Chief of Staff in the S4 War Department General Staff, who had already placed Colonel Earl Hogue in charge of this part of the Plow Project, they came up with a list of requirements for this new vehicle. Studebaker agreed to take the contract and promised to deliver 6 prototypes by July. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick recruited several staff officers to help him, including Major Orville Baldwin as his logistics or S4 officer, Captain Robert Burhans as his intelligence officer or S2, and an old friend and fellow coastal artillery officer, Major Kenneth Wickham, to be his adjutant, or S1. Since his unit would need to be airborne qualified, he recruited Major John Schinberger from the Fort Benning Jump School to oversee operations and training as the S3. It was Major Schinberger who recommended Fort William Henry Harrison near Helena, Montana, as the training location, knowing that as winter came, there would be an abundance of snow. Colonel Frederick visited the fort and agreed that the 2,000-acre site would be perfect, and almost immediately recruits from both the U.S. Army and the Canadian Army started arriving and hit the ground running. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick and his staff had an immense undertaking on their hands. establish and train an elite 2,000-man force completely from scratch. There was no handbook, no guide on how to create such a unit. The U.S. Army Rangers were at that same time being created and trained, but much of their training was inspired by the successful British Commandos that were only slightly older, having been established in June of 1940, barely 2 years previously. One advantage that Frederick and his staff had was that they knew exactly what their mission was and what type of environment they would be operating in, and they tailored the training specifically for that mission. The great composer Leonard Bernstein once said, "To achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time." Frederick and his staff had a plan. In fact, that was all they had, and they definitely did not have enough time, as the mission was set to launch by the middle of December that same year, less than 5 months away. The fact that Lieutenant Colonel Frederick and his staff figured out how to select, train, and evaluate the men who volunteered for this training is beyond remarkable. This is how they did it. On 19 July 1942, newly promoted Colonel Frederick landed in Helena, Montana, one of the very first men to arrive. He was soon followed by the expert instructors who would run the specialized training for what was now named the 1st Special Service Force. Colonel Frederick's XO was the senior-ranking Canadian, Lieutenant Colonel John McQueen, who came straight from the Calgary Highlanders. Major Kenneth Wickham, the S1, came up with the table of organization. Starting with an 8-man section, each section would have 4 of the yet-to-be-built snow machines that Studebaker would call the Weasel. This 8-man section would be commanded by a sergeant. 2 sections would make a platoon commanded by a lieutenant. 3 platoons would make a company commanded by a captain. 3 companies to a battalion under a lieutenant colonel. 2 battalions would make a regiment under a full bird colonel. The total regiment would be 32 officers and 385 enlisted men, which was ridiculously small, as a normal Army regiment would be 4 times as large. The combat echelon of the 1st SSF would consist of 3 regiments, which would total 108 officers and 1,168 men. Now later on, as the force trained, the 8-man section was increased to 11 men, and then finally 16 men. Even this increase in numbers made the force still small in comparison with other regiments of either the Canadian or U.S. Army. Men almost immediately began arriving at Fort William Henry Harrison from all over the United States. The first Canadians arrived by train on 6 August. In fact, American members watched as Canadian soldiers debarked from the train, wearing exotic uniforms from their originating units, such as the 8th Princess Louise's Hussars, the Algonquin Regiment, the Black Watch of Canada, the British Columbia Dragoons, Lord Strathconia's Horse, Les Fusiliers Montreal, and Le Régiment Maisonneuve. The recruiting posters and flyers had worked and enticed plenty of Canadian and American candidates who found themselves living in tents on the barren grounds of the fort. Canadian and American enlisted were mixed together along with NCOs and officers from the very beginning. The new soldiers were immediately introduced to an unbelievably accelerated training regimen. There was no time to waste, and practically the first event was airborne training run by Captain Harry Tug Wilson, the force's jumpmaster, who was an original member of the U.S. Army's test platoon that first brought airborne operations to the U.S. Army. Assisting him was Jumpmaster Lieutenant Robert Ellis. Working under S3 Ops Officer Major Schinberger, even jump training was shorter than the Fort Benning standard of 6 weeks. The men skipped learning how to pack their own chutes and relied on riggers from the force's support echelon. There were calisthenics, double-time marches to every training site, and 5K runs up and down Muscle Mountain to whip these candidates into shape. Most men made their first jump within 2 weeks of arriving at Fort Harrison. Some made it within 48 hours of their arrival, with their second and last jump the very next day. They practiced jumping from C-47 mock-ups and then were hoisted in harness and dropped from 4.6 meters high, simulating a parachute landing. Broken legs and ankles were a high risk until force photographers realized that feet and knees together reduced these injuries. Sadly, any soldier or officer that suffered a bone break found themselves out of the unit, and that included the XO, Lieutenant Colonel McQueen, who broke an ankle on a parachute jump. Airborne training was still brand new in the Army, and jumps were typically done from between 3,000 and 5,000 feet, giving the troopers plenty of time to deploy their reserves if they had any problems. This shortened airborne training was entirely due to the shortage of time available for training. Colonel Frederick personally pinned jump wings on every single graduate. The most demanding and important training done was the long-range ruck marches, 34 miles and longer. It may seem to be the most basic type of training, but it builds the strongest candidates and weeds out the weak. The reality was that one of the most important traits of any commando can be described simply as endurance. The physical ability of soldiers to carry heavy equipment long distances up and down hilly, even mountainous terrain is a critical skill. Combat is a slog, an endless march with heavy equipment, and this type of training strengthened and revealed the men with the mental attitude to never quit, and identified and discarded the men who didn't want it enough. In my opinion, this one simple training event, repeated endlessly, did more to create the legend of the force than anything else. It is such a critical component that modern U.S. Army Special Forces still train this way 80 years later. Hand-to-hand training was led by an Irishman named Dermot Pat O'Neill, a former Shanghai policeman and martial arts expert. O'Neill had come straight from legendary expert William Fairbairn, where they both were instructing officers for the newly formed Office of Strategic Services. Pat O'Neill promised the men he wasn't there to teach them how to hurt, but to kill, using a unique style he called Defendu, a quick and lethal system that focused on a few easily memorized gross motor moves incorporating kicks, edge-of-hand blows, clinches, and quick strikes that focused on eye gouges, throat strikes, and vicious stomps to the neck, groin, or knees. He also taught knife fighting using the V-42 Commando knife designed by Colonel Frederick, starting with sheathed bayonets and then transitioning to real blades. More than one forceman got cut during this type of training, and unlike many of the visiting instructors that came to teach a specific skill and then departed, Pat O'Neill went through all the training with the 1st SSF and became a forceman, first acting as Colonel Frederick's bodyguard and then accepting a commission as captain, leading men in combat. Firearms training was extensive. Initially, the primary rifle was actually the .30 caliber M1 carbine. Only later in training did the soldiers get the .30-06 M1 Garand, and for the Canadian forcemen, though it was slightly heavier than the .303 caliber Lee Enfields that they were familiar with, they loved the semi-automatic Garand and its ability to hit targets at 400 meters. Other weapons included the .45 ACP M1928 Thompson submachine gun and 2 pistols, the .45 ACP M1911A1 pistol and the M1917 revolver. They also received training on the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, though most Canadians would have preferred their familiar .303 Bren gun. One gun both the Americans and the Canadians loved was the M1941 Johnson light machine gun, or Johnny gun. Lieutenant Colonel Baldwin, the S4, had traded the Marine Corps for 125 Johnny guns, which fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the BAR and Garand, but used a side-mounted single-stack 20-round magazine. The trade was for RS explosives, of which the force owned all 70 tons thus far produced for the U.S. military. Captain A.L. Torgerson of the Marines received 2 tons of RS explosive, something they believed would be perfect for destroying Japanese pillboxes. At 13 pounds, the Johnson was 6 pounds lighter than the BAR and had an adjustable rate of fire from 450 to 600 RPM. This weapon did not replace the BAR, but was used in exactly the same role, except that if they broke or were lost in combat, there were no replacements. The heaviest firearm the force used was the belt-fed M1919A4 Browning machine gun, chambered in .30-06. They also practiced with the Mark II fragmentation grenade and fired the 2.36-inch M1 bazooka, the M2 60mm mortar, and even the 68-pound M2 flamethrower. Colonel Frederick also made sure his forcemen received training in a large variety of German weapons, something that later proved invaluable during actual combat. One of the force's missions was to blow up the Norwegian power plants, and so they trained with TNT, pentolite, and a unique and little-known explosive known as RS, or Ryan's Special. It was apparently similar to the newly developed plastic explosives, but had double the explosive power of the standard TNT. The force obtained 2 explosive experts from Fort Belvoir's Corps of Engineers, including Lieutenant Dan Ryan, the inventor of RS, to instruct forcemen in the imprecise art of blowing stuff up. They got permission to blow up old mines and mining equipment along with unused bridges, but had a tendency to overdo it with either too much explosives using the P factor or selecting the wrong bridge to destroy. Forcemen got in trouble blowing up too much stuff and started a minor forest fire. But you can hardly do demo training in the U.S. or Canadian Army without the word excessive making it into an after-action report. Colonel Frederick, in his typical understated way, described it as, in several instances, enthusiasm carried them away. By the way, Lieutenant Dan Ryan was recruited into the force. On 8 September, the first snow arrived in Helena, as had the brand new snow machines. Barely bigger than a Jeep and running on tracks, the Weasels proved remarkable in the snow. Studebaker had come through and delivered an excellent vehicle that the men learned how to drive and repair in the field. Ski training happened in smaller groups at Blossburg, not far from Fort Harrison, where the forcemen would ski cross-country up into the mountains following their expert Norwegian Army ski instructors, led by Captain Einar Kill. What the men didn't know as they were living in railroad boxcars and rotating through the ski training was that Colonel Frederick was fighting to even keep the 1st Special Service Force alive. In late September 1942, Colonel Frederick had flown to England to coordinate mission planning and the air support he would require to infiltrate the force into occupied Norway. Eisenhower was then in England, deeply involved in planning Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Colonel Frederick met with Lord Mountbatten, telling him the force was on track to be inserted into Norway by December timeframe, and that he needed approximately 600 aircraft to transport the force either for an airborne or glider insertion. This turned out to be an insurmountable obstacle. The Brits did not have 600 aircraft available to perform such an airborne operation. Mountbatten felt Marshall had implied the U.S. would supply the necessary aircraft for plow force, but the U.S. Army Air Forces also did not have the aircraft required. To muddy it even further, 1 month earlier, on 19 August 1942, a combined force of 5,000 Canadian troops, 1,000 British commandos, and even 50 U.S. Army Rangers conducted what turned out to be a disastrous raid on Dieppe in France. And Lord Mountbatten had taken the fallout from that failure and lost a great deal of his influence. Churchill still wanted an invasion of Norway, but British Army generals were well into the advanced planning stages of Operation Torch. Nevertheless, Mountbatten gave it a try, presenting the plan to the British Chiefs of Staff, knowing they might be receptive to something that consisted of only American and Canadian troops. Colonel Frederick met with the British Chiefs of Staff that included Sir Charles Portal, Chief of Air Staff, Sir Dudley Pound, Chief of Navy Staff, and Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. But Frederick did not get his proposal past Pound, as he could neither promise Pound that his force could do more damage than what RAF Bomber Command was currently inflicting, nor could he promise that the U.S. would be able to provide enough C-54 transports to conduct the airborne op that would put his force into Norway. In a private meeting, Lord Mountbatten admitted to Colonel Frederick that the force would not get British transport, and that Mountbatten lacked the influence and authority to make it happen. Not to mention, the Norwegian government in exile was highly worried about Operation Plow's mission to knock out so many power plants in Norway in the middle of winter with the potential harm it could do to Norwegian citizens. Frederick fully understood that without Norwegian support, the British Chiefs of Staff Committee would never endorse Plow. Both Mountbatten and Frederick knew it was over. Frederick sent a message back to Fort Harrison to suspend effort on the present line, and as the unit would not be targeting hydroelectric dams, and instead focus on general tactical training to include attacking fortifications, pillboxes, barracks, and troop concentrations. The reality was that Colonel Frederick was stalling for time. The force had no mission and was in imminent danger of being completely dismantled once word got out to Big Army, both United States and Canadian. Executive Officer Lieutenant Colonel Paul Adams got the message and modified the training regimen, except the Canadian Army had already heard the Plow mission was off and wanted their troops back. It turned out it was General George Marshall who talked the Canadian Army into letting their troops stay as Colonel Frederick desperately searched for a mission to keep the 1st Special Service Force alive. On 6 April 1943, Colonel Frederick presided on a reviewing stand in downtown Helena with Helena's mayor, Jack Hayton, and Montana Governor Sam Ford, as the 1st Special Service Force marched in review. The men wore new uniforms, all wearing a braided red, white, and blue halyard over their left shoulder. Canadian Army units wore differing halyards unique to their unit, and many of the Canadian soldiers had initially worn the halyards of their originating units, while the American soldiers wore none. Frederick came up with the idea of a halyard in the colors of both the American flag and the British Union Jack, which remained the flag of Canada. They also wore crossed arrows on the collars, borrowed from the U.S. Army Indian Scouts from back during the Indian Wars, and some of those Indian Scouts were still serving in the U.S. Army in the early 1940s. But the most unique item of the uniform was a red arrowhead patch worn on their left shoulder, with the words USA across the top and Canada down the center. Colonel Frederick watched his men go past while nearly every citizen of Helena lined the streets. It was both patriotic and sobering. It had been nearly a year since many of these men had arrived in Montana. Many had married Montana women, except Colonel Frederick had found a mission for them. They were going off to war. Over the next 2 years, the force built an enviable reputation and was one of the only units that served in both the Pacific and the European theater. They served in the invasion of Kiska in the Aleutian Islands, and then traveled halfway around the world, where they landed in Italy. Their legend was started in early December 1943, when in their first combat operation, they successfully captured Mont La Defensia and days later Mont La Remetania in central Italy. These 2 critical strongpoints had dominated the Liri Valley that led north to Rome, and were defended by German elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division that had previously successfully repulsed numerous Allied assaults on the southern slopes. The force climbed the impassable 70-degree northern backside of this mountain fortress, then assaulted southward down the mount while pushing the Germans completely off. Their toughness and mountaineering skills made all the difference, and Lieutenant General Mark Clark promised them more and better hills to climb, using them extensively to capture tough German positions that had previously resisted all other Allied attacks, confirming the adage that successfully capturing a hill earns you more hills to capture. As General Mark Clark's 5th Army finally defeated the German winter line, newly promoted Brigadier General Frederick found his unit pulled from the line, except they had left many behind and suffered much. His combat echelon, the 3 regiments of the 1st SSF, had suffered 77% casualties, dead, wounded, captured, and missing. His support echelon had suffered 50% casualties, and getting replacements was increasingly difficult. Some surviving soldiers from the decimated 4th Ranger Battalion joined the 1st SSF, but the Canadian Army had none to give, as all their replacements were already earmarked for Canadian infantry divisions. The 1st Special Service Forces legend was cemented when they were landed at Anzio and found themselves on the line facing Germans from the Hermann Goering Division, just 100 meters away across the Mussolini Canal. General Frederick, in an effort to create more distance between the force and the Germans, sent out numerous night patrols, capturing and killing Germans in the dark. Within a week, the force had pushed the Germans back almost a mile. It is Anzio where they earned the nickname Schwarzer Teufel, or Black Devils, no doubt enhanced by their faces darkened with burnt cork and the calling cards they would leave on German dead. The worst is yet to come. General Frederick was often a man who led from the front, and as such saw many of his men die in combat, and observed their dead bodies lying exactly where they fell. Frederick was also wounded numerous times, receiving a total of 8 Purple Hearts. Frederick had a tendency to show up at the front lines without fanfare and in a plain uniform, sometimes entirely by himself, and at other times accompanied by either Captain George McCall from Montana, the Norwegian-born American Lieutenant Finn Roll, or Captain Pat O'Neill. Once, during the breakout from Anzio, force men were in a terrific fight at a crossroads and saw a German ambulance approach the battle. The forcemen held their fire until an entire German squad of soldiers poured out of the back and went to cover in a ditch. One forceman took his 60mm mortar and dropped numerous rounds right on the ditch, effectively wiping out the German squad. When things quieted down, the soldier heard some clapping from behind him and turned to find General Frederick congratulating him on his expertly placed shots. It was forcemen who were the first Allied troops to enter Rome, but Brigadier General Frederick's successful leadership of the force had its price. He was promoted to Major General and assigned to command the 1st Airborne Task Force for Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. This task force was part of the 7th Army commanded by Major General Alexander Patch and jumped behind the lines on 15 August 1944. This airborne task force consisted of the U.S. 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the U.S. 517th Parachute Regimental Combat Team, the British 2nd Independent Parachute Brigade, the U.S. 550th Glider Infantry Battalion, and the U.S. 551st Parachute Infantry Battalion. The 1st Airborne Task Force under General Frederick's command was scattered the night of the jump because of the heavy fog, but managed to complete all of their objectives in supporting the main amphibious landings of Dragoon. After completing their invasion missions, they were kept on the line, and the 1st Special Service Force was added to the task force, reuniting Frederick with his forcemen. By November of 1944, the Airborne Task Force and the 1st Special Service Force was pulled off the line to rest and refit. For the men of the force that had suffered a casualty rate of 134%, had captured over 30,000 prisoners, won 5 U.S. campaign stars, 8 Canadian battle honors, and never once failed to capture an objective, General Frederick's departure the previous July was one of the saddest blows the force had endured. In late November, Major General Frederick visited the remnants of the force, his former command, at Villeneuve-Loubet, near the coastal town of Menton, France, saying goodbye for a second time. His airborne task force was also being disbanded. In truth, Major General Frederick had wanted the force disbanded for many months. He had watched their casualties mount and feared the force would be ground into the dust until none were left alive, and the legacy they had earned all through Italy was completely discarded. General Frederick knew about the 4th Ranger Battalion that had been nearly destroyed in a failed action in Cisterna during the Italian campaign. That unit ceased to exist, and the few survivors ended up in the force. He dreaded the thought of the 1st Special Service Force being completely used up in combat. General Frederick saw the writing on the wall. The Third Reich was doomed, and none of the Allied armies had much use for specialized units. Frederick wanted them deactivated while they were still intact. On 5 December 1944, Colonel Edwin Walker, the current commander of the 1st SSF, called a formation. Formations like this were expected. The men stood under the force's 3 flags, the Stars and Stripes, the Union Jack, and the force's own colors. Perhaps more medals would be awarded. Maybe Colonel Walker was being reassigned. Then Colonel Walker announced they were disbanded as a unit. No doubt there had been rumors to that effect prior to the formation. The men saluted as the force's colors were cased. Then came an order none of them expected. The Americans were ordered to stand fast while the Canadian soldiers were ordered to step forward in a column of 3s. For men who had long since called themselves Forcemen, not Canucks, not Yanks, it was completely confusing. There was no reaction at first, as few understood the order. Then 37 officers and 583 enlisted men stepped out and formed a new formation, leaving gaps in the original formation which the Americans did not close up and fill. For these veterans, it was the worst blow. With many of the American forcemen fighting to hold back tears, knowing their Canadian forcemen brothers would leave the next day to become replacements for various Canadian infantry divisions for the final push into Germany. A similar fate awaited the American forcemen, who were designated the 474th Infantry Regiment separate, and prepared for an operation into Norway, their original destination. Before that happened, 8 officers and 345 enlisted men volunteered and were selected to be replacements in both the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions. The remaining men were constituted as the 1st Battalion of the 474th. A few days later, they received new forcemen replacements from the States, who were constituted as the 2nd Battalion. Then they received the 99th Infantry Battalion, comprised of Norwegian Americans, who became the 474th's 3rd Battalion, which retained its 99th designation. When the war ended, the 474th was part of the Allied occupation of Norway, which disarmed and repatriated nearly 100,000 Germans. When the occupation ended in October 1945, Colonel Walker presented the regimental colors of the 474th Infantry Regiment to King Haakon of Norway as a parting gift. As for Major General Frederick, he had been given command of the 45th Infantry Division, making him the youngest 2-star general in the United States Army. He commanded the 45th in the Battle of the Bulge and led the 45th ID as it crossed the Rhine and captured Nuremberg, one of the symbolic centers of the Nazi Party. In one of their last operations, the 45th ID liberated Dachau. But Frederick's greatest contribution, his greatest legacy, the 1st Special Service Force, was being forgotten. The 1st SSF was not unique in its fade into obscurity. The Jedburghs, small 3-man international teams from the OSS and the SOE that jumped behind enemy lines to organize a resistance, barely survived the war, as the OSS was disbanded in October 1945 and the British SOE in 1946. The U.S. Army Rangers, born of the same circumstances that established the 1st SSF and who had earned a similar reputation, ultimately lost their legendary commander, William Darby, on the battlefields of Europe, where he was serving as the Assistant Division Commander of the 10th Mountain Division. U.S. Army Rangers lasted the longest until 1951, when they were deactivated. But the U.S. Army still had true believers, veterans who had fought in the OSS as Jedburghs and dropped into occupied France, veterans who had stayed behind when the Philippines were occupied by the Japanese, and fought guerrilla wars until MacArthur did return. In 1952, the U.S. Army stood up an experimental unit, 10th Special Forces Group, but the Army would not give Special Forces the lineage or legacy of a civilian unit, which was what the OSS Jedburghs were. What they did instead was give U.S. Army Special Forces the legacy lineage of the 1st Special Service Force. That is why the patch on their left shoulder has a blade reminiscent of the V-42 Commando knife on the 1st SSF's regimental flag. It is why the patch is arrowhead-shaped. It is why the officers and enlisted wear crossed arrows on their uniforms as branch insignia. I guarantee you that every Special Forces soldier, past and present, cherishes the heritage of the 1st Special Service Force to this day. It is why Special Forces Assessment and Selection basically recreates what the 1st Special Service Force did, pumping supplies up the mountain slopes of Mont La Defensia, Mont La Remetania, Mont Viscatario, and Mont Majo. The Canadian Special Operations Regiment, established in 2006, traces its lineage back to the 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion, the Canadian contingent of the 1st Special Service Force. The patch on their left shoulder pulled directly from the 1st Special Service Force. The dagger on their emblem, a copy of the V-42 Commando knife. As for Major General Robert Tryon Frederick, though he was considered a star of the war, he often struggled in dealing with the politics of the post-World War II Army. He accepted assignment in 1951 to command the U.S. Military Aid Group to Greece, and did very well there, and as such surprised the Pentagon with a request for retirement just a year into this assignment. He was only 45 years old, and the Army did not want to let him go, but in truth, he was exhausted. He had spent so much on the battlefields of Italy, France, and Germany that he had nothing left. His daughter described how he would pace the house at night, even in a time of peace, his mind still at war. Any time the name of one of his soldiers killed in battle was mentioned, it reduced him to tears. Every soldier he lost, he carried with him for the rest of his life. Robert Frederick died on 29 November 1970 at age 63 with complications relating to his new pacemaker. He is buried in the Presidio Cemetery in San Francisco, California, and left behind his wife Ruth, 2 daughters, 8 grandchildren, and a legacy of the greatest fighting force of the entire Second World War.